Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. As you can see on the screen, this is the Open Data Opens Doors for Social Impact session. I'm sure a lot of you will have joined a handful of sessions over the last couple of days. So thank you all for showing your stamina and making it along for day 3. I'm sure you're all aware that this session is all about open data and why it's such a powerful tool and why you should engage with open data. In Essex, we are partway through our journey to deliver high quality open data for residents and partners. And many of you will hopefully be familiar with our open data platform, which we will drop a link into the chat for at some point during this session. We've had the platform for about 5 years, and we're really keen to keep building the content that we publish and improving functionality and making data ever more accessible and powerful. But what we really want to do is have some genuine social impact with open data, because we really believe that it's a great tool for change. But as I say, we are part way through that journey and we see quite a long road ahead of us, which is why we've invited Julian Tait along, who is the chief exec from Open Data Manchester. And Open Data Manchester are much further along in their journey around open data than we are in Essex. And I'm really excited that Julian's agreed to come along and talk to us all, because what he doesn't know about open data is not worth knowing, I'm sure. So with that, Julian, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand responsibilities over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tom. And hello, everybody. Thanks for so many of you coming to spend the next hour going through a little bit of a journey of open data, and hopefully you'll learn something from our kind of travails, I suppose. Yes, so I'm going to share my screen. There is going to be a little bit of interactivity, and yeah, I hope that you'll find this enjoyable. I have to actually I have to apologise in advance. I am doing this from home. We have a dog. There's bound to be the post, and all chaos will break loose. But we'll just have to live with it. That's the beauty of remote working, I suppose. So, who are we? So, Open Data Manchester was formed actually out of a community of people from both local authorities, businesses, people who are in the local university, and people who just wanted to see how data could be used for good. And I think what was quite interesting about that, there was a lot in 2010. There was a lot of things that were going on at that time, and some of it I'll come to it in a bit later when I do a kind of little short history of open data. But really, I think people just saw that the data was starting to have such an impact on our lives. And if we weren't aware of what data can and can't do, then we might end up in a not in a particularly good position. Some of you might think, well, we're not in a particularly good position anyway, but at least open data, and I think ethical data practices, which we also are involved trying to promote, does help. So who we are, I mean, we do have a stated mission. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and what that means is that we get funded through grants, but we also do consultancy work, and that work and that kind of surplus from that consultancy work goes back into our social programs. So developing practice, running training events and stuff like that for people who are interested, and just kind of supporting the local open data community. And I think because data is about the way that we live, it's our kind of, I suppose it depicts our reality. We think it should be for everybody. So kind of things of what we do. Well, we do support our community. We do have quite an active event program and support program, and we put on all kinds of and flavors of events, both in our own right, and these can be online and offline, but also we do a lot of things with partners. Sometimes we find that open data can be a little bit of an abstract concept to people, but there are many people who are actually active within their own digital communities, who have their own groups, and we do try and help support those, and then talk about open data and how it can help people with their own practice. So we work a lot with developer groups, and also groups that are trying to enable a more diverse representation within data. And I think things are starting to change from perhaps what they were in 2010. And actually, a lot of the events we put on are led by the community. They're kind of some kind of perceived need of what people want to hear about. And we've done things as broad as, I suppose, how do you save the environment with data? What environmental data is out there, and how can that be used, so we can understand more about what was happening. We did a large event around there's huge flooding events around Manchester a few years ago, especially a place called Hebden Bridge, and trying to understand why that was happening. And because you're kind of introducing people to the subject, and you're creating greater awareness, people start to kind of share that amongst their own communities, which we find of great value. So I suppose, as mentioned, we do kind of consultancy work, development strategies, and work with all kinds of people and places, both locally in Manchester and also further afield. A lot of research, because data it can't be contained. I mean, it touches all of our lives, really, as I mentioned, but working about how we kind of use data better within practice, delivering projects, advocating for better data use, and also exploring with communities. So we do a lot of work at grassroots level, talking to communities, doing programs such as Data for Communities, introducing people to data, what it can and can't do. And actually, part of this talk that I'm going to be talking about is going to draw from a little bit about that work. So what I'd like to do first is just get an idea of where you're all from. I've got a fair idea. I don't know for certain, but it'd be really interesting for me as a presenter, and maybe for you as well, to see where you are. And if you can do that through Menti, that'd be great. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And actually, it'd be interesting to see whether my thoughts are correct. That's great. And you can start to see there's this kind of it's good to have colleagues from VCSE and civil society here, because open data, well, we found that within the voluntary sector especially, the use of data or access to data is really important. And and I don't know whether this is the case where you are, because a lot of the voluntary sector is involved with frontline service delivery. Being able to access data and being able to use data and share data is really, really important. Right, I'm going to have another. Now we know that kind of the majority of you from local public sector. I'm going to ask you another question. So what is your awareness of open data? Because this is quite a contentious issue sometimes, because some people are aware of it, some people aren't. Right. It's good to see that a few people have never heard of it. Hopefully this will help you to understand that. But it does seem to be, and I suppose I was going to use a really crappy data joke here, but I'm not going to. Yes, I am. It looks like it's quite a normal distribution. There you go. But anyway, thank you very much. It gives you a bit of an idea, and hopefully everybody will be moved along up that scale a little bit as we go along. So you'll probably all know about this. What is data? Well, I think that a lot of people get confused about data. Data really is kind of the most abstract abstract representation of reality. It's the kind of thing that we can derive meaning from. And I think a lot of people get confused between data and information. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I think there's the kind of we have to understand, and I think you will pretty much know, you do anyway, is that contextless data isn't really useful at all. And so we need to know, we need to kind of understand how data fits into kind of more of a kind of system of knowledge. So I suppose at its most abstract level, you have data at the bottom of a kind of pyramid, and that's the kind of the data that you collect, the data that you may have systems that collect data, there may be forms or etc. But really, without some kind of additional context, it's pretty useless. And as we kind of add context and we add that experience, it becomes information. It becomes something that's more useful, more usable. And by creating information, then obviously we can kind of draw knowledge from that, because we can take things from different places and kind of say, right, this hypothesis works like this and this. And then obviously we hopefully will have a certain amount of wisdom to allow us to take the appropriate action. So as you can see with this kind of model, this what's called the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. There are kind of other variations of this out there, but it does give you a kind of idea of where data sits at this kind of this lowest level. And it's actually what we do as individuals, and through our knowledge and experience and expertise, how we kind of add to that to make that actionable. And that's where the value comes. The value comes from being able to make the best decisions possible with the information that you have at hand. So that is the importance of data. But what we often kind of say, data is not the answer in itself. And I think this is really important to kind of think about. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it allows you to ask better questions and provide evidence for decisions. It can allow you to uncover patterns, but generally never can provide you the answer itself. And also, and I think people are becoming more aware of this as we start to get into this, especially the arguments around the fallibility or infallibility of technology and data systems. We need to be careful of the biases and assumptions that may be within that, not only in the data that is collected and that we look at, but also within the kind of the assumptions that we have about a given thing ourselves. And I think that's really important when it comes to data, because often data is captured through a system of metrics that have actually been defined, that are trying to make understanding of a certain situation or a certain kind of conditions within the population. But often, sometimes there's a mismatch between what the data says and what people's lived experiences about, and we need to take care about what that data does and doesn't say. And we also need to ensure that the data is trustworthy. And there's been many examples of untrustworthy data kind of feeding into the environment. And as we all know, correlation does not mean causation. And a great example of this is, if you've ever got time, and I'd look into this website. There's a guy called Tyler Vigen who in 2008, when we first started to become aware of him, he does a lot in data, and he just started to kind of create these. He created a website called Spurious Correlations. So through a lot of kind of work, he just found data sets that appeared to correlate, and he would come up with these things called strange correlations. And what was interesting about these strange correlations were they had statistical significance. I mean, if you were kind of had a hypothesis that we believe that the popularity of the first name Kenzie is directly related to UFO sightings in South Dakota, the data would actually probably bear you out with that, with a degree of statistical significance. And it goes further on, and on his website, you can actually choose different data sets to kind of match up. And also it's kind of searches for Never Going to Give You Up, that the eponymous Rick Astley song, versus the share value of Tesla's stock price. Maybe there is a linkage, maybe there is causation, maybe Rick is directly related to the stock price. And what's quite interesting about this process, and why it's a kind of interesting website to read, or at least kind of delve into, is that in the age of AI, he's now taken this from what he started doing in 2008 much further. So AI control the web and find data sets that match each other, and then he's got AI that then produces academic papers based on this information. I mean, they're logged as kind of fake academic papers, but he says this is really, this can be done in the age of the kind of the automated thinking machine, as AI, I suppose is. This becomes a very easy thing to do, and so it's I suppose it's a warning of how bad data can pollute the information space. So we have to be concerned. We have to be aware. We have at least to be aware as data practitioners. And actually, as an event we do, and it is online and it's offline, but every Halloween we do a data horror stories where we invite the community to come in, where they have found these spurious correlations, these tales of woe and bad stats, and it's quite an enjoyable time. It's a bit worrying when you start to hear about some of these things, because you have colleagues from kind of public sector, NHS, private sector, and you just think, I'm surprised we're surviving, to be honest. But there you go. So now kind of had a little bit of a background as to open data. I want to take you through the journey of open data, and I think this is kind of it's going to be brief, but I think it's good to know the context of why we're here and the journey it's taken, and it's taken a long time. And this is like a brief potted history, but you might recognise some of these things. But I suppose open data has been on the cards since the 1980s, actually. I mean, although it's not referenced here, but there was a move towards, as information became more digitalized, especially in research and the academic environment of sharing information, this idea that we need to have information to share because some of the challenges and some of the problems that were trying to be solved needed to have that kind of level of collaboration. There was also a move, especially within the European, it started within the States, this kind of notion of access to information, and within the EU, you had the 1998 public service access to public service information regulations, and then we had the Freedom of Information Act in 2000. And obviously, you'll know, or you probably have experience of freedom of information requests, of which obviously this is underpinned by the Freedom of Information Act. There was also another piece of legislation in which I think was kind of equally as impactful, but in a slightly different way, which was the Environmental Information Regulation of 2004. And so these kind of enshrined a right to access data, but we weren't really set up for doing that. I mean, there was that kind of, well, what's this thing? Why do people want this data? What's it going to be used for? But it really started to get ahead of steam under the last Labour government, and we had a few scandals. There was the kind of the MP's expenses scandal, and there's the famous Duck House saga, when one of the MPs had spent his MP's expenses, or claimed MP's expenses, for a duck house on an island on his very large estate. But then you had this kind of idea that, well, actually the public is paying for this data, therefore it should have a right to that information. but maybe things weren't kind of set up as they were. So, but you had the kind of campaigns, especially from The Guardian, about freeing our data. You had people like Tom Watson, who was an advocate for open data, and you had the Power of Information Task Force that was kind of had a couple of policy people who were kind of advocating for the need for opening this up. There was also quite an important paper that was written by a guy called Rufus Pollock, who was at Cambridge University, which actually kind of, I suppose it started to first kind of create the economic argument for why information should be open and what the economic value to the UK's economy would be. A lot of the figures within that research, I think it was kind of something like 6.9 billion. I should have actually looked it up before I came in, but I do remember that being about right. Was seen as being a large amount of money at the time. It's a large amount of money now. But as the administration transitioned from the last Labour government into the coalition government, there was a real push for the kind of, well, we need to ensure that that data was being used and that it could bring value to UK PLC. There was also a change in agenda, and I think this is kind of when we started to see when austerity was starting to kick in. You saw that this kind of notion of openness and open data was starting to be used as a little bit of a hammer to hit people over the heads with. In Manchester we got kind of stories of profligacy, local authorities spending certain amount of money on catering or hot pots or biscuits. You know, I think if you work within the public sector, you'll know all about these stories. And it was, and you'd have Eric Pickles, who's kind of be there saying, "Well, I want an army of armchair auditors to show how you're doing it all wrong, how bad you all are." And actually, it kind of polluted that kind of the discourse around open data at the time, because a lot of it was to do with how can we make this information freely available so we can actually everybody can do things together rather than it being used as a tool of torture. But as things came on, we had the kind of the data.gov.uk came along, which was kind of this portal that probably many of you will know and have you used or you've kind of submitted data to, which provided this kind of centralized database for the kind of national data sets. And also you started to see local portals kind of cropping up. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. I think there was what was interesting about the early kind of attempts to kind of create local open data portals was there was kind of the underlying infrastructure and the actual rationale for doing it wasn't quite understood, and therefore some of them kind of didn't work so well. The one we had in Manchester kind of stuttered and failed because nobody could really see what the value of it was, but that's now been reinvigorated. Moving along to where we are now, we've now got a lot of activity around data. We've got kind of the national data strategy, and actually what we're starting to see now is a reinvigoration of open data or the need for open data, especially within national government. And I think we're going to start to see this over the coming year or so about this kind of how can we support the development of data standards. How can we help organisations, public sector, make more data available? So we kind of started to see there's a maturity and of this journey and how it's being embedded into policy. But when we started out, and the open data community, because it's open, would share kind of their stories and their travails about all the reasons why data couldn't be made open. And maybe some of these you'll know yourself. Some of them were kind of, I mean, you could actually put that on kind of not just open data, but you could just put that on kind of any kind of data sharing. So if you've kind of been in a situation where you need information yourself to do your own work, you may find one of these excuses may have been used as why you can't have it. There is obviously behind many of these excuses there is there is rational explanations and maybe reasons, but it was quite interesting how these kind of the reasons for why data couldn't be shared started to be logged. And they found out there was a kind of common experience of not only the open data movement, but actually people who are trying to share data and get data used between different departments and try to bust the silos, I suppose, of data use. But I think one of the things that is really important, and it's well worth noting, is that as the open data, the journey has progressed, open data has become more mature. It's become less of a kind of idealistic, just make the data open, we just give us your data kind of rallying call, which was a little bit kind of misguided, if you ask me, to one where it's kind of an appreciation of what data is. Open data is just a kind of state of data. It's part of a broad continuum of data and data usage. There is a lot of data that can't and shouldn't be shared. There is data that may have extremely sensitive personal information that could only be shared in the very strictest of environments. So we have been doing work with what's called trusted research environments, which you get within health, where that data is that will not leave that environment, and it's for very good reason. And then you kind of see how, and this diagram by the Open Data Institute, I think, is really useful because it really visualizes a kind of more broader and matured discussion around open data. Is kind of these kind of layers of access from kind of closed data, which are kept internally within organizations, maybe in departments, maybe within particular systems that are kind of isolated, through to shared data being shared across social services, maybe with health services, etc., through to kind of the more open data, of which we'll kind of discuss later. And actually, what you find, and I think you'll come to understand, or if you don't understand already, is actually a lot of the data that is open is kind of fundamental kind of infrastructure data infrastructure that we build a lot of things on. And I think that we can't actually survive without, and I'll come to that in a little bit. So I think coming to a kind of, I suppose, a really good example of data and how it has been utilised. And funnily enough, when we do the Data for Communities workshops, and this is kind of working with the communities, voluntary sector groups, and we also get local councillors and local authority officials coming to these workshops as well. One thing people are really interested in is how they connect to place and geography, and how geography is managed, and it's very, very complex. But a lot of the geographies that we work within are available to us if we wanted to kind of dig down. And I'm sure a lot of people will be aware of the different types of geographies. Maybe not to the kind of level of complexity of what's seen here. But this is kind of a picture from the ONS of the kind of representation of UK geographies, from administrative geographies through to physical geographies, through to health provision, through to security, etc. So within Greater Manchester, it's a conurbation of 2.9 million people. It's got 2 cities, 2 wannabe cities, many towns, and I suppose it's a little bit like most areas. So it has a particular geography. It's in its sense, since 1972, it has been a county. And people talk about, when you're talking about sense of place, people try and understand, well, are they from Manchester? Are they from Salford? And it's kind of this is the entity of Greater Manchester. And within Greater Manchester, and this is all open data that I'm using, you kind of have local authority boundaries. What you find when talking to residents is that generally people aren't, people know that they kind of pay council tax in one area versus the other, but generally accessing services, this is a level of abstraction that they're generally aware of. It'll say on the boundaries of the boroughs that you're now entering X, Y, or Z, but they're not too bothered about it. If I can dump my rubbish at the tip in one borough and I'm allowed to do that, that's fine. I don't really need to know. But within the local authority itself, so this is Manchester, and it has parliamentary constituencies. What we find when talking about open data, with especially with communities, is about where that there's an administrative geography, which is obviously the local authority, the local authority manages, but there's also a kind of democratic geography that exists within that. And there's a certain amount of tension we find when we're talking to people about well, I tell my councillor to do this or the MP to do this, and it may not, that geography may not necessarily overlap on that kind of area which they think it is. And we have lots of conversations around that, and ward boundaries as well, which obviously exist within local authorities, and obviously create this environment to enable people to be represented within the decision making of that represented within the decisions that are made within the local authorities. And obviously, as people who work with data, you're probably aware of lower super output areas, which are another granular level of abstraction within those local authorities. And obviously there's super output areas underneath that which have even more data, but generally the information is not made available, or it's in aggregated format. And then we start to talk to people and communities about things that are mapped onto those types of geographies, such as the IMD, which is often been known as the £1 billion data set, because so many decisions are made off that. And actually, what's quite interesting when talking to residents about relative deprivation, and I have to say, there are caveats around this, because I think IMD, especially when it comes out, it can be very, very stigmatizing, and sometimes I think in certain contexts it's not very helpful when talking about deprivation, because communities often don't perceive themselves as being like that. These are very top-down statistics, said about representation within communities, but it does give an interesting picture. And as we can see, because the IMD has been published over a number of years, you can start to see how things change within communities. And we find that talking to people are very interested in this. People are very interested in how their communities have changed, what's happened. And obviously we always talk about, well, this tells you some things, but it doesn't tell you everything. You know more about the places where you are. We've had conversations with local councillors who go, I didn't realise my ward was as deprived of this, and not realising that they actually represented a social housing estate. And so this is why open data is really useful when you go out to talk to people, because you can start to give people a better picture of things that perhaps people were aware of but didn't know for certain. So another little question, another two questions that I'd like to ask you before we delve into some live examples. Have you ever experienced problems trying to find the data you need? I think that's quite it's quite telling. It was quite an obvious question. I think if anybody says no, I'd like to know who you are. And the undecided. I think in anybody's, when we started, we did a lot of work with Trafford Borough Council, who and I think this was the back of an envelope calculation, and somebody in their performance and intelligence, I'm trying to think what we've remembered now, actually, what the department's called, did a calculation on how much time is wasted by people trying to find the information and the data that they need to actually do their job. And it was quite huge, actually, and they kind of extrapolated. And then when you extrapolate things into different contexts, things are going to go all wrong. But it gave a bit of a picture. And actually, what it also kind of indicated was often when people can't find the information they want, they have to start, or they start constructing the information themselves. And so you end up with kind of two versions of the truth. Whose version of the truth is better, and that's where you can kind of get kind of complications. So it's not necessarily a question about open data. It's a kind of problem around data availability and being able to find data that you think you should be able to use. But it is really linked, especially when we talk things in the context of that data spectrum that I showed you earlier. Okay, next question. Have you ever been asked to share data or make data open? That's it. That's interesting. That's quite an interesting one, because we haven't got space to kind of actually then find out whether those decisions were actually you shared it or you didn't. But I think there's obviously we can see there's a need for data to be kind of made more available, and people are being asked to kind of make that data open, or to share it to help others kind of do what they need to do. It's entirely scientific, obviously. We must say that. So now the next thing is going to be, well, there's this saying, I suppose they say in acting, that never work with children and animals, and I'm going to say never try and do something live, because it's bound to go wrong. But I'm going to do a little bit of an exploration into a couple of open data platforms. Hopefully you'll humour me by joining me in this journey. We were originally going to do this as breakout rooms, and then we realised that is just going to be chaos. So I'm just going to go through everything, and hopefully, I mean, if you can do a screenshot and you're interested in this kind of stuff, I hope you are, because if you're not, then it means I'm quite a sad individual. I will show you a few things about open data, and I think what's interesting about open data is that it's more prevalent than people think. So I'm just going to I'll show you an example. I'm going to start off with public transportation. So I don't know whether you can see this. I can see Tom, so he can tell me whether he can see a map.
I can see a map.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm on Google Maps, and this is the area where I kind of live. And I've got it selected so I can show public transport, because obviously in urban conurbations, public transport is probably the most efficient way of getting around, if you're lucky to have fairly decent transport infrastructure. So obviously Google Maps, Apple Maps, whatever maps you tend to use, will have national coverage. So I'm going to click on Southend-on-Sea, right? A place that some of you may know and love. And obviously there is a data layer that underpins me being able to navigate around this. And you probably use Google Maps, you probably have sat navs, and that data is being pulled in. That data is a collection of proprietary data. Google has been collecting huge amounts of data, and it sells that data, but there's a lot of open data that's underneath it. And when we talk about public transportation, there is a massive amount of data that underpins that. So what I want to do is click on Southend Station, and hopefully it will actually do what I want it to do, which is kind of show me the oh, that's Southend Victoria. I want to gone to the wrong station. I need Southend Central. Right. That could be Southend Central. So here it shows me a picture of Southend Central. That is proprietary information. I'm more interested in the public transportation. So it says here trains, probably know C2C trains. I can click on this and it will show me the times of the next train. So it's a standard departure times, shows me how long, whether train's delayed, what platform they'll be on, where they're going. So Southend Central is on the Fenchurch to Shoeburyness line, which you'll probably know. And it's very, very useful because obviously if you are doing route finding, route planning, and you need to get from A to B using public transport, being able to key into transport schedules is really, 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 really useful and allows you to get around. There's many transportation apps that are actually based on this information. So it's basically there was a National Rail was told to make their scheduling information, their live train times open, and it did it, and this has enabled this. You can also do this for buses as well, although buses tend to be, since the Bus Act, there's been the Bus Act in I've forgotten when it was, actually 2018. Bus companies release data, but it's still a bit patchy. So trains generally a better bet for navigating around with regards to open data. So there's the data in Google Maps. But if you go to National Rail, it's kind of presented in a different way. So I'm kind of I want to go from Southend, Southend Central, and it'll show me the same information, really. It might show me a little bit more information, but basically it's pulling on the same open data. So we can see journey details. It'll even tell me where the train is, and that information is available as open data. So it enables us to get around it. It allows us to understand how things work. It knows if we're going to be delayed, which is often more often than not. Same open data is used in this app called Tiger. So what this is, it gives a more granular view of the same data, but in a slightly different way. And that's the beauty of open data, really, because it's open. People can use it in different ways according to their needs. They can create things that will give the data in certain ways for certain audiences. And this is actually been made to actually enable the people who work in the stations. You see the staff view, to know how the rail system is functioning itself. So if I go to kind of a CIS detailed summary with train graphic, and you can have this on the website. The link is in there. You can use this as I know that some organisations have this particular website on their on a screen in their lobbies or whatever. You can see the trains that go into London Fenchurch or Shoeburyness. You can see where the cycling is. It doesn't. It shows you how many carriages it has. You can actually get this app. You can actually go onto this website on your phone, which is really useful if you're a rail station and you don't know which end of the platform to stand at waiting for a train. And this is coming from that same feed. Now, for the more nerdier people, you can get this kind of view, which is, and it's the same data, but this is kind of for your train spotters and your and I suppose people who run the railways, who kind of understand, or they want to see what aspects the signals are on the line, where all the trains are, if the trains are being delayed or stopped somewhere, and everything will have a code such as this. 2D, which is an arcane system. It comes from steam trains, but it'll show you that it'll allow you to access data. So I just wanted to show that kind of example of how data made open, it can then be used in different ways for different audiences, but it is the same data, it's just sliced differently. Flooding, I mentioned flooding. There's a lot of interest about flooding. I know from speaking to Tom. This also is a concern for residents within Essex as well. And there's a wealth of data made available, and a lot of it is in real-time data. So you can kind of click on the environmental flood maps and see where the state of particular flood levels at particular points within the UK, which is really important, obviously, if you're kind of trying to work out whether you need to move your car or things like that. It's a particular interest. So we get a lot of flash flooding, especially up towards Calderdale, which I mentioned Hebden Bridge, because the water runs off the hills quite quickly. And obviously this is keyed into various other systems that will allow the flood alerts to go out to people, to residents, to tell them that they have to be aware there's a flood event happening. We live quite close to the Mersey, and we occasionally, well, about once or twice a year, we'll get an alert saying you need to consider that there is a risk of flooding. And this data is made available. Some of you probably know this already. Made available openly, and there's many different ways that you can slice and dice this information. You can also access things like flood maps, which show you the propensity of flooding, and that data that allows planning. It allows people to understand that their flood risk, and obviously that impacts on people's insurance prices, etc. Their ability to kind of insure their properties. How that is all derived. It's about allowing people to kind of understand their environment. And lastly, as far as this whistle-stop tour of things, it is not a map at all. It's about grants. So billions of pounds of grant funding is made available in the UK, but there isn't really a big picture of how or where this is spent, but the data is made available, and so there's sites such as GrantNav that will allow you to do that. So I can put in somewhere like Colchester into here, and some of you may know the areas, some of you may know the organisations that will come up, but it'll give you a picture of how much money has been spent in Colchester from the various. It's not every grant source that is available, but since 2009, since 1995, 352 million pounds has been grant funded through various forms. It'll tell you kind of who those grants have gone to, who's paid those grants, what the date is. A lot of it's national lottery, but what it is, and what we found useful in Manchester, especially as an open data exercise, is that the voluntary sector, the community, is supported through various different means. Being able to understand how that is supported is really important. In 2000, around about 2007, 2008, and I think just as austerity was starting to kick in, within Greater Manchester, there was a collapse of the voluntary sector. There was kind of local authorities were unable to kind of afford to fund community support services. And that had a real impact on how grants were being dispersed in areas to communities that needed those grants. People weren't applying for grants, and it could be seen within this data. The data isn't totally complete, but it gives a good picture of how things are supported. And when we talk to voluntary sector organisations, we've got to say, well, it shows you who's funding what. And also you may find something that an organisation within the UK that's doing something similar to what you're doing. And that is and that will help you understand what people are funding. And so sites like this are of great use, I find. Anyway, I'm going to, oh, sorry, I've stopped sharing. I didn't mean to stop sharing. I meant to get off this screen. I'm going to have to share again. Sorry. I knew there'd be a mistake somewhere. So yes, that was a quick trip. I hope you can see the links to the websites. Yep. And so I'll just wrap up. Hopefully there may be a little bit of time for questions at the end, but I think I've rambled on too much, and I think you probably all want to go get some food and stretch your legs. But the rationale about why we do a lot of this stuff is because, I mean, this is coming from an organisation that's got open in its name, is that a lot of the challenges that we are facing, we can't do them alone. We need to collaborate, and we need to share, especially when some of these problems are systemic. And I think by being more open in the way that we do things is really important, because what one person may know may be useful for me to be able to do what I need to do. As we've seen, people wanting information, people wanted to share, because at a time, especially when we're in kind of austerity still, this is really important, that we pool knowledge, we pool our resources, and we try and pull together as a community. So a couple of quick announcements. If you are into open data, like I am, I know Tom is, there's an event that happens, and it's on a weekend at the beginning of July. Some of you may know about this. It's Open Data Camp. The last Open Data Camp was in Wolverhampton. It travels around the country and to the various nations, but we are lucky to be hosting it in Manchester in July. It's a free event. It's a weekend event, so obviously you've got to either you love open data so much, or you would like to see Manchester. It's, as I say, it's free. It's bringing together a community of practice, a lot of people from local public sector, national public sector, but it's a way of kind of just finding out what people are doing and just getting to know the networks of people. Yeah, and we're trying to make it as inclusive as possible. So we're trying to work out how we can provide creche facilities. We're going to be providing kind of low-cost accommodation in student halls of residence. So if everyone wants that experience again, it was. Have you ever been in a halls of residence? Maybe not. But we haven't, the tickets aren't available yet. But if anybody wants to keep in touch with regards to that, please do. And I think that's it. So if you want to find out a little bit more about us, there's the website. If you want to subscribe to the newsletter, where we kind of make announcements of the project. But if anybody just wants to get in touch and just wants to have a chat, we're generally available to help. And yeah, thanks very much. I shall stop sharing now. So,
thank you, Julian. I think just
you're on mute, Tom.
Oh, have I come off now? There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much, Julian. I think it's been a really helpful and interesting session, and I think for me, the rail data is such an interesting case study of how open data really enables people to do what they want with data. And I think a lot of us in the audience will have worked with data in the public sector and worked with the same data set over and over and over again, and be asked to cut it in thousands of different ways for thousands of different audiences. And I think it's such an interesting case study where we can see how the same data can be so adaptive and allow people to do what they want. And I guess that's part of what we want to do in Essex, right? Is with our open data platform, the more we can make available through the platform, the more we can enable our district council colleagues or our health colleagues or our voluntary sector colleagues or whoever it may be, even people outside of the public sector, to utilize that data to make decisions that benefit the community. I think it's such a, like I say, it's a really powerful example of that. So I really appreciate you talking us through it. We've got 3 minutes on the clock, everyone. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to maybe pop your hand up or drop something in the chat. but otherwise we are basically done. I will just quickly flash up this. Is our feedback form for the Data Talks conference, and please feel free to use the QR code on the screen to tell us about your experiences of the last few days, and thank you all for attending.